Welcome to the Women at the Top podcast interview series. My name is Regina Barr, and I'm the founder of Women at the Top, and I will be your host today. Women at the Top, for those of you who don't know us, is a community of like-minded women who share the WAT vision and mission. And our goal, simply put, is to empower aspiring women to lead. And we do this in a couple of ways, by providing training and connections and information. Joining me today is Dr. Carrie McCrudden of Colorado Therapy Care. And before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Dr. Carrie. Dr. Carrie has been in the therapy field since 1994, becoming a licensed psychologist in 2003. She is a doctorate in counseling psychology from the University of Northern Colorado, master's from the University of Denver, and bachelor's from the University of Virginia. She has a broad background, including 20 years of owning her own private practice and a decade of speaking experience, 12 years in community health experience, and a history of teaching for the University of Northern Colorado. Dr. Carrie currently splits her professional time between individual therapy, treating anxiety and trauma, and doing consulting and training on team performance improvement for businesses. Both modalities start from the idea that the person and organization is not the problem. The problem is the problem. Dr. Carrie focuses on helping clients, both individuals and organizations, to improve their habits, become more psychologically flexible, and gain the tools to skillfully manage issues and better identify values and characteristics associated with living and working your best life. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carrie. So welcome to the call today.
Thank you, Regina. I'm really excited to be here.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here today. And I have to be honest, I think this is such an important topic to be talking about. You hear so much of the anxiety and stress and mental health challenges that we're all facing. I guess we're still in COVID, but as we're starting to wind out of COVID too. So I want to start with my first question. And you have worked with lots of clients and you've helped them manage through stress, at your own practice in Colorado, doing individual therapy as well as the business consulting side. Yep. So given that current situation with COVID, why do you think it's more important than ever that we figure out how to manage our stress?
Well, I think it's critically important to talk about skillfully managing stress because our stress levels are rising. It was interesting. I was taking a peek at the American Psychological Association's Stress in America 2020 results, and they took a look at how globally we're functioning. And 67% of Americans indicated that their stress levels had increased either moderately or significantly in the pandemic. And one of the other interesting tidbits that they found is that our maladaptive coping skills, so our negative behaviors in response to stress, are also rising. So we're seeing increased alcohol use, increased suicide rates, and decreased sense of connection with other people.
Yeah, it's a little bit scary to hear you say that out loud, but I think a lot of us are seeing and hearing that in the news. And I'm sure some of the folks on our podcast today are actually experiencing it in their own lives. Now, I do a lot of work with emotional intelligence, and, stress can be a cause for many emotional and physical ailments, which sometimes we don't want to believe, but it's true.
It is true.
I had a stress injury once and I did not believe the doctor. It took me a while. This was many years ago. So I'm a believer now. But given that, stress can make us feel out of control, why do you think emotional intelligence is so important? And what are some of the components of emotional intelligence?
Emotional intelligence is actually a really complicated topic. There's 3 main models to it with 15 subtypes and traits. But if you break it down to its most basic, it's defined as being able to recognize and work with both your own emotions and the emotions of others. And this is critically important at work, especially because we've all been in a workplace where there's one of the low EQ people on board. Mm-hmm. And these are the folks who are argumentative, they're blaming, they have really a difficult time managing change. poor coping skills. They tend to be the know-it-alls, right? Like if you say like, oh, I'm so excited, I got to, go for a hike today. It was 3 miles. Well, I went on a 5 mile hike this weekend, like those are
The one up.
all,
Yep.
yeah, that one-upmanship. And those characteristics of EQ, low EQ, make a work environment very unpleasant. As Daniel Goleman, one of the fathers of the emotional intelligence movement, says, people don't leave bad companies, they leave bad bosses. So the
And
higher we can get our
yes.
IQ, the better for everyone.
Yes, absolutely. And what's interesting, you might not know this little tidbit, but when Daniel Goleman started really working in the corporate realm, one of the first companies he worked with was American Express right here in Minneapolis.
Oh,
And I had the opportunity, he worked with a local consultant to really kind of flesh out his corporate program.
mhm.
And I had the opportunity to hear her speak. And that was my first introduction way back in the 90s to emotional intelligence. So I love that you quoted Daniel Goleman because he really, I think, is the person who put emotional intelligence on the map. So,
Absolutely. I would agree.
yeah. So let's talk a little bit about psychological flexibility and how that pertains to mental agility and adaptability.
Mhm.
And first of all, how is psychological flexibility associated or related to emotional intelligence? And why, when people rail against reality, is it fruitless and unproductive? Tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So, psychological flexibility is the ability to recognize and shift behavior in the face of changing reality. It's all about getting involved enough in the present moment to understand what's going on both internally and externally, and then asking yourself, what's my next best move? And the core piece of emotional intelligence is flexibility because it means you're being responsive in the moment and you can learn from the past and you can also move towards what you want in the future. And
I think
one,
that's,
oh, go ahead.
really important, that responsiveness,
Mhm.
because um and being in the moment too. I think most people, we're always thinking like two steps ahead, or we're focusing on what happened yesterday, and sometimes you need to let that go and not worry so much about there and just focus on what's right here in front of you.
Absolutely. And that's where this is a sort of famous comment of mine, like, don't rail against reality. It's both fruitless and unproductive. Railing against reality, it increases suffering and it tends to just spin us out instead of moving us forward. And we've all been there.
Hmm.
Everyone has said, I'll be happier when I've lost 10 pounds, or I'll be happier if I finally find my partner. I'll be happier if my mother in law gets off my back, or fill in the basic, I'll be happier if my boss stops being this way or that way. And, I can only do well if. That is an example of railing. All of those are examples of railing against reality. It's not accepting and acknowledging what's actually going on in real time right now. And it's important to notice that acknowledging and accepting reality does not mean that you've approved of it. And it
Right.
does not mean that you're acquiescing to it. It just means that you're factually observing, hey, this is going on. And then giving yourself credit of like, I can work with this, or like, whoa, this is not okay with me.
Hmm. It's interesting in a COVID environment. I wouldn't necessarily describe myself as super emotional, but I have felt more in touch with my emotions. And sometimes, like, I'll say something to my husband, and he's like, "Oh my gosh, are you feeling sad?" And I was like, "Yes, I do feel sad." And
Yes.
just like being in the moment and just acknowledging how I feel in that moment. And so I joke around with him because, like, I'll tell him how I'm feeling. He's like, "Oh, is this how it's going to be? You're telling me?" I said, "Yes, I'm speaking my truth now." So, I mean, you have to have a little bit of fun with it too. But I think it is very important to know kind of where you're at emotionally and be okay with it. We're gone through an unprecedented time over the last year. And I think a lot of employees are having trouble coping with it. And I think your advice to just not rail against reality and accept that what the reality is for you at this given moment, I think is really great advice. So I do appreciate you sharing that with us.
Yeah, and
So,
it links into emotional intelligence, because if you understand what works well for you and what's harder for you, then you can notice it and do something about it. For example, I'm a really high novelty person. I
okay.
like to travel, I like to research new things, I like to talk to new people, I like to go to new restaurants. And in COVID, all of that novelty has gotten very
Yes.
constrained, right?
Hmm.
And so noticing, like, oh, I don't enjoy this constraint, and I'm still going to be a high novelty person. So, an example of railing against reality is just getting upset about the constraint.
Hmm.
Using emotional intelligence is more like, all right, I can't go out to dinner right now. So, what new wonderful thing do I want to try? Or
Hmm.
let's go on the same hike. Last March and April, I was going on the same two hikes, right? It was either Lookout Mountain or Matthew Winters Park. And I live outside of Denver. And I was, trying to be respectful of COVID guidelines and all of that. And at the same time, also still get outside. And it's like, all right, I'm limited to two hikes. How can I go and make it new today? Can I beat my time
Right.
from last time? Can I try and find a new wildflower? Can I see how many deer can I watch today? And so making even something that was technically the same, very narrow boundary, opening up and widening that
Yeah.
really felt good.
Expansive. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I was talking a little bit about COVID-19, and I think we can all agree COVID-19 has been a large source of stress. But some of the studies showed that stress was going up even before COVID.
Yes.
So, um, if I'm stressed, how can I use my emotional intelligence and psychological flexibility to help me? And we've kind of been talking a little bit about that, but
Mhm.
tell us more about that.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I think is important for your listeners to know is that emotional intelligence is a skill, and all skills are things that can be developed and can be tapped into. And I also think it's important for folks to understand that emotional intelligence and stress have an interesting relationship. So, emotional intelligence is really on a bit of a continuum. So, it's easier to access that psychological flexibility and those easy, enjoyable emotions, and the ability to notice other people's emotions and react to them skillfully when you're having a really great day. When you're having a really stressful day, it taps on those skills and you tend to have more rigid responses. And interestingly, folks with higher EQ scores, higher emotional intelligence, typically experience less stress because they're actually increasing their ability to tolerate stress. And so that dynamic of higher stress pulls on your EQ, and at the same time, higher EQ minimizes the effects of stress. And so understanding that balance, I think, is really important. And
Hmm.
using both psychological flexibility and those associated EQ techniques can help you get clear about what's really going on. And then you can make choices instead of have reactions.
Well, what I liked what you're saying is, in my mind, that's all about building resiliency in
Yes.
yourself. And I think that's really important, especially right now, where I don't necessarily know if it's considered chronic stress, but it's kind of, well, I guess it is kind of a chronic stress because I
Mm.
think a lot of people have low level stress that they're dealing with all the time now, in a
Yes.
way that they haven't dealt with it before. So I think when you're talking about that psychological flexibility and your EQ, I really believe that's how we can build out our resilience. So I
And
think that's
all three absolutely interact and interplay with each other. The higher your EQ, the easier it is to be psychologically flexible and the more resilience you have. The more you build resilience factors, focus on psychological flexibility, the more you've built that skill of EQ.
and that's kind of a self-perpetrating cycle, which in a good way.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. We're talking a lot about stress. I would hazard a guess many folks listening in today are experiencing stress on some level. And I also like to tell people good stress is still stress. So,
Yep.
getting married, getting a new job, a lot of times we think of stress in the negative, but stress is stress. So, give us some concrete steps, if you will, about what can I do if I'm stressed that will be easy and effective to implement, and I would say, particularly for those in the workplace.
Absolutely. So we're often bullying ourselves to think differently or to suppress our feelings. And it's interesting, there's a study out of Harvard that was taking a look, he calls it the ironic effect, which is where the more you're trying not to think of something, the more that thought comes up. There's a study out of Stanford that took a look at emotions and found the exact same thing, which is that the more you suppress your emotions, the stronger the physiological reaction of those. And so, this idea that if we can somehow make ourselves think or feel differently, then we're going to be able to access our actions differently is actually upside down. So if you imagine that you were in a room right now, and let's say there's a very loud boom, right?
Mhm.
And the loud boom is someone slamming a door. We jump first, physically jump. We tend to feel a flash of fear, normally sort of in our chest or in our guts, second. It's very quick. And then we think to ourselves, oh, it's just a door. So physiology first, emotions second, thoughts third. So one of the things that happens when we're under stress is we will be increasing our stress by ignoring our bodies and trying to push our emotions down and trying to move our thoughts into a different direction. So instead, soothing your body first, which typically looks like taking a breath, settling, lowering your shoulders, settling into your body, acknowledging the emotions that are going on, and then thinking through what are my choices. That actually works better and more quickly to help us assess the stressful situation, to manage it, and to make a good next move.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, as part of this process, I am not a meditator. I have to be honest with everyone who's listening in today. I like to do walking meditations. So,
Yep.
sometimes I will listen to, I started this last year, a daily wellness app, and I heard Deepak Chopra, I don't know if he's saying his last name correctly, talk about a meditation. And so he was talking about when you're feeling an emotion, like if you're feeling sadness, he said, acknowledge the sadness, but instead of saying, I feel sad, he said, say, there is sadness. And
Mhm.
he talked about how to honor and recognize those emotions, but then also be able to move past them. And again, this is from someone who doesn't meditate, and I don't often listen to his little program. Frequently I skip past it because I do better with some of the other wellness
Mhm.
programs, but I happened to listen to that day. And I think sometimes, intuitively we tune into what we're needing. And I think I needed that at that time. So I appreciate you saying to people, we need to honor those feelings, not just try to stuff them down, because the reality is when you stuff them down, that's when those other ailments and other things start to incur, and they can literally make us sick,
Yep.
impact our performance and some of those other things. So that's a great tip for us. We all work with other people. So
Yep.
what could we do when we see someone else, could be a spouse, could be a friend, could be a coworker who's really stressed out? What can we do to help them?
So I think one of the first things to talk about is what not to do. So we often talk first to someone's thoughts. And again, going back to that notion of trying to settle physiology first, acknowledge emotion, and then move into thinking through strategizing and choices. So we'll often tell someone to calm down. In the history of calming down, no one has ever calmed down because someone has
Right.
told them to calm down, right? You tell someone to calm down and their body floods with stress hormones. So
Mhm.
it's great to acknowledge like it looks like you're having a tough moment. So first acknowledging what's going on and then talking through and seeing if you can help someone get into their body. At work, it's a little bit tricky to instruct someone to breathe or to take a sip of water. But you can certainly ask somebody to let's just take a minute, let's just take a break for a minute and then come back to it. So that's essentially giving them some space to get into their body and settle.
Yes.
If you have talked about things as a team already, you have an opportunity to say, hey, remember, like we got to settle first, and then let's sort through what we're feeling and what we would like to do about it.
So it's interesting because if I'm being very aware of myself, I know exactly when I'm hitting a boiling point.
Yep.
And I tend to be, you mentioned hiking. I like to walk and like to hike and things like that. And so I have always found for me, number one, and I tell this to a lot of my clients, the first thing is stop the momentum of whatever's going on.
Exactly.
And then each person has to know what that thing that's going to help them get through that. And if they can share it with someone, great. For me, I used to always joke around. I would just say to like team members, I remember early on in my career working in what I called the corral with a bunch of people I worked for, a mutual fund company, right? And we're all on top of each other and the
It's a
phones are ringing
dog
and
pile.
yeah, and doing trades and really stressful. And when then you get a bad call and I would put it on hold and so I couldn't take any more calls. And I would just be like, I'm going on a walkabout. And literally, I would
Yep.
just go walk. And the other thing is because psychologically, I would get a cold glass of water
Yes,
from the
that's a
cafeteria.
great.
It's a visual cooling down, but then also drinking it cooling down. And then, so for me, it's always been something physical. And I still to this day do that since I work from my home office and many are working from home. Sometimes I even will put on a fun song and just kind
Yep.
of party out, a party of one, if you will. So I think it's really important that people know what will help them, um, because then they can also help other people. And I'm sure in the work that you're doing, in the work that I'm doing, and how well you know a person, a lot of times it is easy for me to say, let's take a timeout, or do you need a timeout? Or,
Yep.
you know, um, even like sometimes I'll say to someone, gosh, you seem really distracted and a little stressed out. Should we reschedule? I have no
Yep.
problem if you want to reschedule. And then sometimes that's just enough to get people talking and they can, and in that way you can help them move past. So I think, there, it's like in the airplane where they say put on your own oxygen mask on
Yep.
first. So you really have to be good at knowing yourself and being able to do that. And then when you're good at that, then I think it gets easier to help others. So I think that's
Well,
great advice. I appreciate that.
and one of the things that you can do if you're in a workplace where you haven't had a delightful conversation about all of the different ways that you can soothe yourself and increase your own emotional intelligence, one of the ways that you can use your emotional intelligence is as you're watching someone get escalated, you can give them a break, not necessarily by calling them out, but by acknowledging two main techniques that I'm thinking of right now. The first is just saying, man, this is a difficult situation.
Yeah, I think that's great. Or this stinks, or,
Yeah, this
you
stinks.
know,
Wow, this is a tough client, right? Or like, hey, we know that so and so tends to be a tough client. Let's all take a minute and really decide how we want to approach this, right? So offering just that acknowledgement of the difficulty can often be the thing that just cuts tension. The
yes,
other is if you're in a place where it is more difficult, you don't have the ability or maybe the right level in the hierarchy to say, I think you need to take a break. You can say, gosh, you know what? I forgot something in my office. And you can just quickly turn and go grab a glass of water or do something. And it gives them that space without you
exactly.
having said, I think you need some space.
Exactly. Or you can always take a restroom break,
Yep.
we all have to at some point. So
Yeah.
um I think that's good advice too, that sometimes we could model and what you're saying is by doing that, we're giving someone else permission to also
Yes.
take the time and space they need. And I think that's really important too. So we are winding down on our time today. And
Okay.
I always like to ask, I guess, for what I would call the practical and tactical. So what's a couple of ways that in particular busy working women, you know, what can they do to better manage their stress in what would be considered an emotionally intelligent way?
Absolutely. So, just reminding everybody that there's incredible value in flexible, emotionally attuned awareness and regulation. And with that, you can effectively assess a situation and make skillful moves instead of getting rigid, stuck, or avoidant. And if you find yourself in a stressful situation, I have a very quick exercise I can teach folks. It
Okay.
uses the acronym ACE: acknowledge, connect, engage. Acknowledge, whoo, this is tough. Notice the stress that's flooding in your body, notice it, and then connect with your body. One of the easiest, fastest, and most confidential ways to do this is to press your left foot into the floor and suddenly see if you can feel all 5 toes. Approximately 0% of our life are we trying to pay attention to all 5 toes, right? And so taking just a moment, press a foot in, press your other foot in. See if you can just take 10 seconds to feel your toes. And then, if you can, if you're in a place where you can do this safely and reasonably, close your eyes for a second, open your eyes, and re engage with the environment in a way that you hadn't before. Like as I just did that, I noticed you have that pretty flower card behind you.
Oh, fun.
And what this does is number one, it acknowledges reality. And then it uses that power of physiology to connect back in with your body, and then helps you re engage in that present moment so that then you can make some skillful moves using that emotional intelligence.
That's great. And I'm chuckling because I guarantee when as soon as you said to push your foot in the floor, everybody was trying to push their foot in the floor and trying to feel all of their toes. So, sometimes even just the act of doing that kind of like
It
gets you
pulls you
out of
back in.
yourself. Yes,
Yep.
in a positive way. So, and it's not even about getting the toes touching the floor. It's about that physical pulling yourself outside of yourself. And
Yep.
so I just cracking up because I guarantee everybody was just trying to
Uh
do that. So, well, I want to thank you so much for being with us here today. I really appreciate it. And your message is just really timely, I think. So thank you for being with us.
Thanks,
And for those
Regina.
listening in, that concludes our interview with Dr. Carrie McCrudden of Colorado Therapy Care. Just a reminder, you can learn more about Dr. Carrie at coloradotherapycare.com. And again, thanks for being here. And for those of you still with us, please visit reginabarr.com, where you can learn more about our upcoming podcasts and programs and other events on the event page. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining me today. Have a wonderful day.